Thank you. Thanks, Steve, and welcome and good morning, everyone. This is our first keynote session, and it's my privilege and honour to welcome Professor Anthony Reddy to give this keynote address. Professor Reddy has recently been awarded the prestigious Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship for his exceptional and sustained contribution to Black theology in Britain and beyond. Anthony Reddy is an established and committed scholar in the field of Black liberation theology, who has dedicated his life to research, teaching, and in-depth scholarship in the United Kingdom and around the world. Originally from Bradford, Anthony is rooted in the Methodist tradition, both as a scholar and as a Methodist local preacher, and he served the Methodist Church in the training of its preachers and clergy, enabling those preparing for ministry to engage with issues of race, class, and diversity. Anthony is a fellow of Wesley House, Cambridge, and was recently appointed as the director for the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture within Oxford University, where he is also a fellow of Regent's Park College, Oxford. Anthony is the editor of Black Theology, the international journal, which is the only global international journal of Black theology in the world. He's also Professor Extraordinarius in the Department of Practical and Systematic Theology at the University of South Africa. And in 2018, he became the first ever Black person to receive an A rating in theology and religious studies in the history of the National Research Foundation in South Africa. So, Anthony, it is a privilege and a joy that you are a keynote speaker for this conference, and we very much look forward to your address now. There will be some time for Q&A at the end, but we look forward, first of all, to what you have to say to us. Thank you, Professor Reddy.
Thank you. It's indeed an honour to be with you here this morning. So my talk is entitled Embodied Wisdom and Proverbial Wisdom, the Spiritual Resistance of the Windrush Elders. This work is a long-standing area of interest for me, really, that goes back over 20 years. At the back end of my doctoral studies at the University of Birmingham that I completed in 2000, there was what was at that point was no more than a mere addendum to the work. And so the main part of the work was really looking at faith formation and Christian education of African Caribbean children. And the main part of that, working with the great Professor John Hull at Birmingham University, was very much around curriculum development and looking at the psychosocial, theological, and cultural aspects of creating an alternative curriculum that was rooted in Black experience. Almost, as I said, almost as an addendum was this last bit that kind of tried to shoehorn into the research, which was really looking at the wisdom of the grandparents of these children with whom, and young people with whom I was working. And that interest has since grown. So the first iteration of that came out in a book that was published actually 20 years ago, this coming April, called Faith, Stories, and the Experience of Black Elders. And in that book, I made what were the initial tentative explorations of a theology of this particular community of Caribbean migrants. I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by the Windrush in a moment. That work has since been updated in various forms, and most recently in my 2019 book called Theologizing Brexit, where in one of the later chapters I look at phronesis, at the explication of practical wisdom as a way of locating that as a form of decolonial form of knowledge that challenges white hegemony. So the purpose of this presentation is in three parts. First part is the kind of background to understanding these Caribbean elders. and the role that they have played within British society and the shaping of their experience and the phenomena of being Caribbean elders, being Black elders in Britain, mainly located across the whole spectrum of church tradition in Britain. So historically, the bulk of this community would be Anglicans, then Methodists, and then increasingly Pentecostals. The second part is to look particularly at expressions of Black phronesis, expressions of Black proverbial wisdom, and the way in which it destabilizes notions of monolingual white Eurocentric hegemony around how we understand what is orthodox with a small o Christianity that comes out of a context of British exceptionalism and mission Christianity. And then the third part is hopefully to look at the socio-political implications of this. So firstly, just something very quickly about the background to this paper. So I think it's important that I locate myself. Yes, this is a Yorkshire accent, so I've lived for 37 years in Birmingham, but as they often say, you can take the man out of Yorkshire, but cannot take Yorkshire out of the man. So I'm still a Bradfordian boy, and this is still a Yorkshire accent. But the antecedents of my identity lies in the Caribbean. My parents were part of the mass migration of people who came from the Caribbean to Britain between 1948 and 1971. Roughly somewhere in the region of 750,000 people travelled. And this is called the Windrush Generation. And it's called the Windrush because the first people who travelled were 492 people who travelled on the 22nd of June in 1948 on a steamer ship called the SS Empire Windrush. And so the Windrush landed in Tilbury Docks in Southampton on the 22nd of June. And these people came from across the Caribbean islands, and they were invited, and they were the first group of, as I said, approximately 750,000 people who came effectively to do the work that white working class people no longer wanted to do. So although Britain won the war, it was very much a Pyrrhic victory. So Britain's defeat of the Axis, particularly Nazi Germany, came at a tremendous cost. And so the devastation of the British economy and the loss of lives, particularly of men of working age, meant that there was an acute labour shortage. And so the Labour government of Clement Attlee passed a Commonwealth Immigration Act that gave the right to all people in the Commonwealth to come to the mother country to work. Now, the truth is that was really aimed at the white settler communities of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Africa, or Southern Africa. They didn't really expect or particularly want Black and brown people from the so-called new Commonwealth to come. However, they're the ones who are more impoverished and came. And so there was a scheme from the British government that was involved all types of inducements and subsidized travel for people to come from the Caribbean islands and led from the Indian subcontinent to come to Britain, and mainly to work in heavy industry and to work in public services, particularly in terms of London transport and in the National Health Service, in terms of women working usually as auxiliary nurses. In understanding this community in terms of their embodied wisdom of these elders, who obviously were not elders when they came in the post-war period, that my own parents came in 1957. They came in, at that point, in their late 20s. But clearly, as we move 70 years on from the Windrush, these are now elderly people in their dotage. And I've been studying them really for the last 25 years or so, in terms of just trying to distill their wisdom and their sense of finding a way of belonging in a nation whose indices for belonging is still predicated on whiteness. in order to understand the community, you have to understand something of the antecedents of their experience of being in Britain. And that really comes out of mission and colonialism and empire. And these things are inextricably linked. It's in 1857 that David Livingstone, the explorer and missionary, working through the auspices of the London Mission Society, coined the 3 C's of empire. So in a talk in Oxford in 1857, he said that the basis of the British Empire was commerce, civilization, and Christianity. And so Christianity provides the philosophical and theological underscoring of empire that is about commerce and about the white man's burden, the civilization of natives and heathens. This exporting of Christianity via the European missionary agencies in the 18th and 19th century was largely undertaken under the aegis of empire and colonialism. Christian mission, therefore, has always had a difficult relationship with non-white bodies or with the subalterns for centuries, as they have been deemed as the other. And a telling quote comes from perhaps the doyen of post-colonial biblical hermeneutics, and this is Professor R.S. Sugatharaja. And he says this, and I quote, "Empires are basically about technically and military advantaged superior races ruling over inferior and backward peoples. When imperial powers invade, the conquered are not permitted to be equal to the invaders. This was true of all empires, Roman to British and American. The basic assumption of superiority is never questioned in their writings." End of quote. That's R.S. Sugatharaja from his 2004 book, Post-Colonial Reconfigurations. So African Caribbean people come from the Caribbean to Britain, and they come with an existing faith that has been nurtured and implanted through colonial expansion, through particularly English colonial expansion, in my case in the Caribbean. As I said, I'm a child of empire. Reddy, R-E-D-D-I-E, is my father's name. But actually, historically, it's a slave name. It's not a West African name at all. It's a name that comes from Scotland. And so what that tells you is that even in something as seemingly nondescript as a name, is that at some point in the past, in the 18th and early part of the 19th century, a white person from Scotland of Scottish descent owned one of my descendants as chattel, as objects to be acquired and valued. And so Christianity emerges in the Caribbean and in other parts of the empire in terms of this dialectic between the sense of belonging to the religion of empire, Christianity, commerce, civilization, Christianity, help to define empire. And so people like my parents and other people of the Windrush generation came to Britain as communicant members of these historic missional organizations. The church had sought to evangelize and to adopt a form of Christian formation on these individuals. So when my parents came, for example, in 1957, I still remember seeing the first passports on which they came, which were the blue British passports that indicated that they were part of the British Empire. That in 1957, Jamaica, from which they had come, in the largest English-speaking island in the Caribbean, that island had not yet become independent. That would not happen until the 6th of August in 1962. So they came as British subjects. But I think right from the start, I think what the literature shows and a number of ethnographic work, including my own work, has shown, I'm speaking to these individuals, is that generation existed in a liminal state. That they were Christian and children of British Empire, and therefore that made them insiders. They came as people who had an intrinsic sense of belonging because of the missional work that had been undertaken by the major churches, including my own, that's the Methodist Church, through the MMS, the Methodist Missionary Society. So they belonged, and hence the invite to come back to the mother country in order to work. And yet they were outsiders by virtue of being black in a country in which the indices for belonging was predicated on whiteness. And therefore, the Windrush Generation have adopted a number of strategies for resisting the aforementioned socio-political pressures of not belonging. And key to this has been the power of narrative, and as I describe it, covert religio-cultural practices. That's central to understanding this community of aging elders within Britain, and particularly their role within Christianity and within major churches, is to understand the power of African Caribbean religious and cultural attention that is often found in a number of ways in which they have used this to deal with the existential crisis of not belonging whilst wanting to belong. And a classic example of that in terms of belonging but not actually belonging can be seen in the deportation of members of this community by the Conservative government in the last 4 or 5 years that we've has now been called the Windrush scandal. And for those, I don't have time to go into it, but essentially what has happened is that people who came from the Caribbean, their status as citizens, as nationals, was complicated by changing the rules that was undertaken, I think, on a very covert manner. That required people to re-register in order to become something that they had formerly had as part of their birthright. And therefore that led to some people being here for 50, 60 years, being deported back to countries that they left a long time ago. And in some cases, people being deported back to Caribbean islands, which they had left as infants. Because the underlying premise was that somehow, even after all this time, they did not really belong. Delroy Hall, the leading Black British pastoral theologian, talks about Black life in Britain being a form of existential crucifixion. And in using that term, existential crucifixion, what he says is, he says that for many Black Caribbean people and other Black people from the continent of Africa who have been here for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, we exist in that liminal state of Low Saturday, that we've been through our crucifixion, but Easter Sunday and liberation and freedom has not come yet. And so we are mired in a form of existential crucifixion. So in the context of this existential crucifixion, to talk about embodied forms of phrenesis, forms of covert religious practices that exist, I believe, as forms of resistance to white hegemony, particularly white supremacy and white entitlement that has existed for the past 5 centuries. A central aspect of African Caribbean resistance has been the ways in which everyday culture is embedded with concealed practices. Many African scholars of religion have spoken of the ways in which diasporan Africans who were taking from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas and imposed upon them was an enslaved identity. Historic African beliefs and religio-cultural practices, that these did not disappear, they were simply buried in a subterranean fashion and used in very concealed ways as forms of resistance to white hegemony, particularly through the aegis of a white Jesus and a very colonial form of of an imposition of British Christianity. And so many of their ancestors, their former selves were hidden within seemingly commonplace and everyday practices. As African Caribbean religious cultural tension operates as a form of resistance to notions of purity, that central to the development of mission Christianity was often predicated on notions of an absolute fidelity to the faith of empire. But actually, if you read the literature around mission Christianity, this push for purity was seen as, was expressed in the sense of this demarcation of the differentiation between the purity of a fidelity in Jesus Christ expressed through European white hegemony, expressed in the form of mission Christianity, as being in opposition to the syncretism and the abased nature of indigenous religious practices that were utterly and wholly condemned. And peoples were expected to convert and to resist the latter, these indigenous forms of knowing and selfhood, in order to take on the identity of whiteness and mission Christianity in terms of absolute fidelity. And what one sees is that, of course, enslaved Africans did not do that. What they did was a form of mimicking. So on the surface, they were dutiful Christians who would adhere to their Christian teachings of their white slave masters. But underneath that, there remained a series of covert forms of religious cultural practices that were partly a homage to their former selves, a way of connecting to the cosmos of their inheritance as people from the landmass of the continent of Africa. But also, it's a form of existential identity as a way of being able to connect not only to one's past, but to find a form of resistance to a form of religious imposition upon themselves as enslaved peoples. I want to give two examples of that. And some will have heard me perhaps share this before. This is something that I inherited from my own mother, who inherited that from her mother, who inherited that from her mother. So this goes back certainly over a century within the Walker/Reddy family. There is a tradition within many Caribbean families in which when one gets and says one prayers, says their prayers, and then leaves the room, one leaves the Bible open at the Psalms on your bed. This is a tradition, I said, I learned from my mother and she learned from her mother. The Bible as a word of God contains power, and it is used to delimit the influence of rogue spirits, or in popular Jamaican parlance, of obeah. So what this has done, it is an amalgam of West African belief traditions that have been merged and fused with Christianity. So on the one hand, that the Bible as a word of God has the power to resist all forms of rogue and forms of malignant spirits. Part of what developed particularly within the Jamaican tradition, was the notion of a form of conjuration, as some scholars call it, which is the invocation of the spirit and the attempt to gain power and mastery over one's enemies by invoking powers of the spirit, forms of animation, in order to impose negative consequences upon other people. And so obeah is part of a long tradition of African-derived religious traditions and practices that have their roots in West Africa and are expressed in various parts of the African diaspora within the Caribbean. It's called different things in different places. And this sense of this form of covert religious traditional practice usually involves a person going to a holy, I say a holy person, to a type of medicine person, a type of primal practitioner in the religious cultural arts. And usually one will take a object from the person on whom one wants to perform some form of divination. So it may be clothes, some other aspects of their apparel. One then takes that to this wise person, this primal practitioner, and asks them to devise some form of incantation on that particular object, which is then returned to the person against whom he's seeking to effect some type of mastery, even some type of negative consequence upon them. Essentially, this is what you do to the people you don't like. It's what you do to your enemies. A way of countering that is that one then can go to an alternative person if you feel that someone has indeed put some type of incantation on you as a way of resisting that. The single most important thing to realize about this, in terms of this form of proverbial wisdom, is that, of course, it's rarely written down. There's only a handful of studies that have ever been done on this for a whole variety of reasons, partly because as a form of concealed practice, most people will not talk about it. So even when I tried to do research on this about 10, 15 years ago, to find people who would talk openly about either using obeah or habit, it was very hard to find research participants who would speak explicitly about this. Secondly, is the fact that it is illegal. The British made obeah illegal in 1850. And although the Jamaican government, although Jamaica has been independent since 1962, and there have been various attempts, I think, from anthropologists, sociologists, academics, to ask the question, why is this still illegal when it's often been an intrinsic part of resistance expressed by people of African descent as a form of religio-cultural retention? Various governments have not unbanned it. It still remains banned in the island of Jamaica. And therefore, not only is it banned, it's also a social taboo. So I remember making the mistake of saying to my parents that I want to do research on this, and they were apoplectic in horror at the fact that their good Christian boy who'd been brought up in Sunday school within the Methodist tradition and was a local preacher had even the remotest interest in something that, quite frankly, he should know better than, because this was of the devil. I did try to say to them that actually, if you look at the negative consequences of various religious practices, I would clearly submit that white English mission Christianity has been more dangerous to Black people than obeah. That more Black people have died at the hands of the imposition of slavery to which white Christianity colluded than anything obeah could ever have conceived in terms of killing people. However, that, let me be clear, is a minority argument, because most Black Christian people will not agree with me. So leaving the Bible open on one's bed has been this type of adaptation of this form of religio-cultural form of resistance that is a way of trying to repel the threat of obeah by having the word of God open as a means of a form of spiritual protection in one's household, particularly when one is not present in that house. As I said, there's very little literature on that. The most serious work I'm aware of, certainly from a theological rather than, let's say, an anthropological or sociological position, is comes from a book called 3 Eyes for the Journey. 3 Eyes for the Journey. And the author is, and the name just escapes me for a moment, it'll come back to me in a moment, but it's called 3 Eyes for the Journey, and it's Oxford University Press 2004. And that's one of the few texts that have been done by a theologian who has looked at the theological development of this form of concealed proverbial form of phronesis. The second one, which I want to look at very, very quickly, I'm aware of the time, is this sense of the dead and the living existing along a spiritual continuum that says that they are not utterly disconnected from us, and therefore another form of concealed practice exists as the Windrush Generation's way of knowing and a way of understanding selfhood is through what many of us have called like the 9 nights. So 9 nights is that when someone dies, for 9 successive nights, friends and family will come to the house of the deceased, and they will offer support and comfort. It's a form of extended wake. But central to it is the belief, which again actually comes out of West African traditions, barely written down in many places, is the belief that it takes 9 successive nights for the spirit of that deceased person to travel over the land of the ancestors. 9 successive nights. And at any point in that 9 nights, that's the spirit of the person who has departed may yet return to the household. So therefore, part of the spiritual resistance of this in terms of the of the community that descends on them is to support them and to enable the soul of that particular deceased person to transition in a peaceful manner over to the other side. What's always been interesting about this is that this exists again as a very subterranean form of practice that exists among Caribbean elders. And certainly there's always been this delicate balance, particularly for those who belong to historic white denominations, and particularly if you have a white minister in pastoral charge of the church in which you are located, because these practices, again, are not deemed illegal within the British context, but they're certainly not seen as being acceptable in spiritual and cultural terms within the context of the practice of white British Christianity. As I once said to a class when I was teaching in theological education at the Queen's Foundation, and one of the classes I used to teach was Pastoral Liturgy. And I would often joke that actually, for white people who are going to pastor Black Caribbean churches and Black Caribbean people in churches, that would have to accept that there would be aspects of their lives that pastorally you would not get access to. So when 9 nights happens, usually the minister, in fairness, whether white or Black, is not invited to this event. It's usually started off with the oldest person in the room pouring a libation, which basically means taking a bottle of white rum, usually overproof white rum, and then pouring it onto the ground, or usually these days, because people have carpets and stuff, you probably pour it into a plant, into the soil. And the first drink of that actually goes to the ancestors, but goes particularly to the in name of the departed person who has passed over. There was certainly one comical moment, which I think I may have shared with some people who have heard this talk before, where there was a particular very, very white evangelical minister who had found out about this and was quite exercised because he felt that this should not take place because this was not Orthodox evangelical Christianity and was somewhat exercised by members of his church taking part in this practice. And so basically, he was determined to turn up to the house and not leave. Usually what would happen is that a minister would turn up to this particular wake, would stay for a discrete period of time and would then leave. Once they're left, then the 9 nights ritual would take place. This particular person turned up and was determined that he was going to stay for as long as it took to ensure that this practice did not happen. Of course, what then happened amongst the elders who had the conversation about this should happen, but we don't want this minister to curtail it, is that, of course, there was nothing in the informal rubrics that said that this had to happen literally in the house of the deceased, so long as it happened in the community. So what happened was that some people stayed in the house with the minister, and the event was just transported to another house, in which like the 9 nights took place. And so the minister stayed in the house thinking that he was doing his good Christian duty of curtailing the agency of these black elders, but all they did is just relocate to another place, and he wasted his time all night. I still laugh at that particular minister, but like we won't say who it is, and I will spare his embarrassment. Therefore, I think to conclude, what I think is significant about this, and so one of the work I tried to do both initially in Faith Stories and the Experience of Black Elders, and more recently in Theologizing Brexit, and also in another book that I wrote a number of years ago that's been republished called Is God Colorblind? Is to find ways of trying to teach and to pass on some of these traditions to their forebears, to younger people, to people not so much of my generation in the 50s, but to people in their 30s and to teenagers, because I think there's something that we need to retain about this, because what it operates as is a form of resistance to whiteness. It is a critique of mission Christianity. It's a critique of traditional evangelical Protestant piety. I'm not saying there's anything absolutely wrong in that, but those traditions were not created with us in mind, and they do not subsume our spiritual identities, people of African descent. It's also, I think, a politicization of Black folk wisdom, that in a context of Brexit, where we've seen a resurgence of white nationalism, into which many British Christians voted. In France, and Brexit is reducible to that, but it is a manifestation of white nationalism. That forms of phronesis, forms of embodied and sealed practices and traditions, and there are many others I could talk about, but I've only named 2, are a riposte to this sense of us being colonized subjects framed within religious traditions that have always been exemplars of white hegemony and socio-political imposition upon Black selfhood. Forms of Black phronesis are ways of rethinking the world and rethinking truth, rethinking epistemology, rethinking what is the nature of belonging, and what are those subversive tropes one can invoke as a way of repelling forms of monolingual notions of belonging and acceptance. There are other ways of actually thinking about this. In secular terms, there is the importance of cricket and the way in which we identify, well, certainly with many of us of a certain generation, identify with the West Indies cricket team, for example, as another form of an aspect of sort of religio-cultural retention that ultimately sort of challenges white hegemony. How one teaches this and how one finds ways of enabling these facets not to die with this community of people who are now in their advanced age. So my father's 87, will be 88 this year. And that generation who are increasingly and obviously now dying off, as a lot of them actually were born in their 1920s and 1930s, is I think that the key theological and cultural and communitarian task of my work and other Black religious scholars in the UK. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony, for that stimulating and thoughtful, thought-provoking address. We do have some time for questions. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, there are 2 ways of doing it. Either raise your hand on the raise hand button, which is either, you can find that either in participants or in reactions, depending on the version of Zoom that you have. So if you can click on that. Alternatively, you can put your question in the chat, and then I'll read it out for you, for Anthony. So if anybody has a question, please feel free to click on the raise hand button or else to put it in the chat. Okay, thank you. Okay, Angelique has a question. So over to you, Angelique. Thank you.
The question I have is, knowing what you know now about the history of being a Caribbean person of faith, how do you reconcile that by still being in an organized religious institution? So for instance, for myself, the Church of England, how do you reconcile that? Because it's such a hypocrisy and contradiction, but I still want to be a person of faith. How do you reconcile that and keep your sanity?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think there's a variety of ways of answering that. I think at one level, it's a very personal conversation. So I think even within my siblings, that there are four of us who all of us grew up in the Methodist Church in Bradford. And I think myself and Richard, so I'm the eldest and Richard follows me, I think we both kind of stuck with the church. My sister was the youngest, she's kind of liminal, so she's kind of on the edge of it. And I would probably say is more spiritual than religious. And then Chris, who's the third son, has just largely rejected it completely. I think for me, I think for a variety of ways and reasons. Firstly, of course, as all of us know, Christianity is a very complex phenomenon. And whilst there was a strong narrative around imposition and around white hegemony, which obviously cannot be denied, it's also been the means of Black resistance. So when one thinks of the ways in which Black Christianity emerged out of the enslaved tradition and has become an important means of challenging white hegemony. So for example, the biggest slave rebellion in the Caribbean was initiated by a guy called Sam Sharp as one of the 6 national heroes in Jamaica in 1831, and Sam Sharp was a Baptist deacon. And so for him, actually Christian, his sense of resistance to white hegemony came his understanding of his faith and believe in Jesus Christ as a liberator, and learning to read and reading the Gospels for himself. What he said very clearly is that Jesus is on the side of the oppressed, not on the side of the slave masters. And so I think for me personally, in terms of being still remaining a Christian theologian, it's about identifying those liberative motifs and asserting those as the means of my own spiritual identity. As a Methodist, I'm also, I suppose, I have to say, very much within a radical tradition in which our founder, John Wesley, was one of the few committed anti-slavery leaders in the 18th century. And certainly, I think a number of years before his death, actually wrote his very influential pamphlet in terms of his notes on slavery, in which he exhorted Methodists not to engage in the slave trade and to be anti-slavery forms of resistance, although they largely ignored him. But even so, that was his very, very clear teaching. So I think Christianity is complex. I think people obviously have to make their own decisions around that. But for me, I still think there is enough within the radical traditions that come from the prophets, that go into Jesus. One finds it a bit in St. Paul, although Paul is a very complex person, and then finds it particularly, I think, for me, in forms of radical Christianity that have always been on the side of the poor and the marginalized and the neglected. So that's why I would say that I'm not just a Methodist Christian, I'm particularly a Black liberation theologian.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got some questions coming in the chat and another couple of raised hands. So I'll go with one of the chat questions next. From Mayuk. Thanks for the sharing. How could you preserve the wisdom of the elders into the development of our shared theology / spiritual practice in the UK?
Yeah. Actually, so one of the things I tried to do a number of years ago, which I, in more recent times, I've sort of resurrected ecumenically with a number of former students of mine, is around how we use the practice of mentoring within small groups to help to preserve some of these stories, some of these practices. And one of the best ways of doing it is actually through storytelling. And so one of the things I developed in my earlier book, Faith, Stories and the Experience of, was published by Jessica Kingsley in 2001. I think it's still in print, actually. It's probably like the longest book of mine that's ever stayed in print. But anyway, we'll move on from that. Is the way of sort of creating sort of storytelling circles. And so storytelling circles really was a way of getting elders alongside the younger forebears. So really a kind of intergenerational storytelling. And each group telling to each other stories of significance. And actually, it was through that I learned a lot of the stories from my mother and from some of the elders that I put into the work that I've tried to pass on. There was a time, certainly 30, 40 years ago, when that happened more naturally, where because communities were much more compact and homogeneous than they are now, that there's a sense in which that storytelling across generations would happen naturally. It happens less so now because families are more dispersed and social mobility has made us not as homogeneous as we used to be. And so therefore what I'm saying now is that it needs to be slightly more deliberate. I think Zoom makes it interesting because I think in some respects it makes it more difficult because we're not meeting in an embodied fashion. And certainly some of the older people are not as comfortable on this particular platform. Obviously, it assumes a certain level of being able to engage the technology to use it. But where it has been used, I think it's been very powerful. So even last Sunday, I was with a Methodist church, a particularly Caribbean Methodist church in Birmingham. Spark Hill Methodist Church, where we had our covenant service, and the covenant service obviously is very particular to Methodism. What's interesting was that within that, what we also had, alongside all the normal rubric that comes out of the Methodist worship book around what you say in terms of the service, was also a form of phronesis, a form of practical wisdom storytelling, which some of the older people in the group shared stories of what was significant for their own sense of the preservation of their identity and their sense of rootedness, that hopefully some of the younger people in that Zoom meeting will have heard and will remember. So I think that's one way of doing it.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anthony. David Martin has a question. So let's move over to David.
Hi, Anthony. Thank you so much. That was, it resonated so much with what you were saying, because so much of the political and social analysis that you have in there parallels the Irish experience, which was one of the first colonies that continued. But what interested me too was the aspect of Angelique's question about the organizational and the participation. And to me, it seems that in our contemporary culture, where people are becoming more aware of the rights basis. Okay, so I don't want to detract from the particular emphasis that you have on the racial thing, because I think that's the preeminent one. But it can go past skin color. So most Irish people were white. But what I'm interested in is even in your framing of it, the polarity of black and white. But because of the Caribbean experience, especially, I mean, there were Irish people were forced to go to the Caribbean area under Cromwell's time and stuff, and the interracial mix then. So it wasn't just that your community was owned by slaves. There were Irish people that integrated as well. And so when that on a biological basis, even the combination of racial things. So it's not racial purity either way, it's pure black. And so then the integration of that can only, from moving forward from the history, because we all have inherited that, but moving forward, there has to be a common agreement on a rights basis. And I think there is scriptural and biblical basis for that. The fact that a privileged generation weren't willing to serve because of their cultural superiority is a challenge within the rights frame. So we don't have to just smash up the structures and the institutions. I mean, you obviously, as a British person now, working within those structures, within Methodism and within the university and academic thing, are demonstrating the way forward, I think. So really my question is, not how can we diffuse the racial thing, because that can't be ignored. I mean, that is the preeminent thing, but to expand it so that it's the inclusive thing. And I think, I mean, I haven't heard or seen your work on Brexit, but I'd be interested because it's a very live issue here as well. So again, just thank you. And so you've challenged me to follow up a lot of strands there. But I think the question is, how do we elaborate the integration or working within the structures that exist and not get distracted and use the right space?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I've been trying to do in the work, so it's in the Brexit work, but I think in some of the more recent work I'm doing now, is to destabilize the whole notion of race anyway. It's a construct. It is an illusion. Clearly, it's an illusion that then has dangerous consequences in terms of how people are categorized and in terms of its impact on social policy. But I think anything that destabilizes notions of solidity around forms of categorization, I think is important. And therefore, part of what I think about using this stuff around phronesis, and so therefore using, for example, like the integration between quote unquote traditional Christianity and engaging with forms of religious otherness that has been formally at best, it has been viewed in a very deleterious manner, that somehow this is stuff that like you really should have outgrown, and it's kind of taboo at best, and at worst, as I said in the case of opiate, it is just downright made illegal. But actually, when you then play around with that notion in the paper, I didn't go into it, but there's this notion of sort of multiple religious belonging. That actually I see myself as belonging to a variety of traditions. Some of those traditions are part of what comes out of my ancestry in Africa. Some of it is expressed in my sense of being a Methodist. Some of it is expressed in terms of other influences. And so it's interesting that this notion of purity is something that was just so replete within the minds of the colonialists. And this notion of this separation, hard separation between peoples that actually has no basis in any kind of intellectual fact is what we need to refute. And therefore that sense of multiple religious belonging for me is both a metaphor for a way of talking about interculturality. So an important work in this regard is Emmanuel Larty's book, In Living Colour, where he talks about interculturality and says actually all of us live in a fluid way that absorbs a variety of cultures. And what that then does is it destabilizes notions of race, and it destabilizes notions of hard forms of solidified human existence that somehow says that we are so disconnected from the other, however you construct also who the other is. And therefore that sense of interculturality is something that exists within Christianity, like we see it at Pentecost, we see in terms of Revelation, we see at various points in the scriptures, this sense of belonging to a community is one that is both transcendent and immanent. So there's a sense in which we are located in a particular place. There is particularity, but that particularity doesn't bind us in fossilized fashion that then disconnects us from others who are not like us. And I think that's the work I'm trying to do in order to destabilize this fixity around what it means to belong, which I think that we see in terms of the very doctrinaire way in which, like, the Brexit debate, for example, was done. I mean, so even to the point whereby if you were offering some type of counter narrative to critique it, then somehow, like, you were not being British and you were a Ramona who was simply not buying into this dominant narrative that says that actually our decision's made, now shut up and get on with it. And some of us are saying, actually, what about the dissident voice? Because that has to be taken into account lest we fall into forms of prototypical fascism.
Thanks, Anthony. We actually have 5 questions and a little less than 5 minutes.
Oh, wow.
I'm wondering whether we'll be able to squeeze as many in as possible, but we might not be able to manage all.
Yep.
I'm taking them in the order that they've come in. So this is from Janet. As part of Faith in Black Lives Matter network, we're looking to create practices that challenge white hegemony. Something weird happens to covert knowledges when they are shared in public and white spaces. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, very quickly, in terms of the questions to come. Yeah, I mean, that is a real live issue, because I think, and actually even doing this paper and this work has left me with a kind of ambivalence, because part of me wants to share it because I think covert knowledge and that subversive element is transformative when we allow it to filter into and to challenge the existing forms of epistemology that have governed the world. On the other hand, part of its power is because it has been covert and it has been secret. And certainly I had a number of my friends who said, Anthony, I'm like, you're not giving away our secrets. I mean, you can't tell people everything. And I think that's one of the tensions, actually, that part of me as a scholar wants to explicate this, because I think it's rich, it's deep, it's sophisticated, collecting, enriching. But the truth is, part of the survival of Black folk is that, I'm not to quote my mum, she'd always say to me, Anthony, it's not everything you know that you should tell white people. And she's absolutely right. It's not everything I know that I'm going to tell white people. And so that's a tension. I don't have an answer to it, to be honest with you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Another question. What subsequently happened to the Windrush generation here was totally wrong. But going back to when they were invited and supported to come to the UK, this was not exploitation. They were not forced to come. Do you agree?
I would disagree, because I think one of the things about poverty is poverty takes away agency. And the Caribbean regions of the empire were impoverished. They were impoverished through the greed of white capitalism. Therefore, notionally, you have a choice. But put it this way, if you're in rural Caribbean and there's poor education system, certainly in Jamaica and various islands, actually, like, education is not free. It's not free because the government can't afford to make it free. And you have very little recourse. The biggest exportation in the Caribbean islands has always been migration. People have to leave. People have to leave in order to make a living. And they have to leave because their countries are being exploited by white European nations. And so therefore I would reject that. That they had to come because poverty tells that you have to come. And then when you come, you then do the jobs that white people, I'm sorry, but I would reject that, because we also understand the historical flaws that made these countries dysfunctional in the first place. And they were dysfunctional because they were never allowed to exist on their own terms. Their only basis was to bring capital and resources back to the center and to enrich the British.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 more questions. Do you think we can squeeze them in, or are we?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
thank you for
I'll be brief.
Okay, thank you for what you're sharing and writing. Are there examples of UK churches that have found ways to honour and celebrate this diversity and rootedness across generations and cultures? If so, how?
Yes, there are various churches that have done that at a very individual level. So I'm talking about denominations, I'm talking about individual churches, and particularly if you have pastors or people in the leadership who have some type of, that they're au fait with these various forms of religion and cultural traditions, then what the churches have done is that they've found ways of engaging in various forms of enculturation so that the church reflects these different cultures and traditions. I can certainly put something into the chat box, or at least maybe sort of send on some ideas to the organisers that can then be shared with other people. So yeah, so there are pockets of it, but there's not a big movement per se.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. And our last question is from Dr. Christine Lai. So Christine, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Redding. I'm particularly interested in your personal context in the African Caribbean background, and also the 9 nights, worshiping the soul to transition. In the Chinese culture, we have also welcoming the souls to be back to home after 7 days. And these 7 days are very important for families together. And also in the funeral rituals, we will have Confucian or Buddhist kind of rituals. So the pastors or priests, Catholic priests or church pastors will come and join with us and respecting these kind of rituals and contexts. So it intrigues me in terms of the intercultural integration of Christianity coming from the West, but also based on love, care, and faith together, and mixing and integrating or having an intercultural dialogue with our, for instance, Chinese cultural roots. Because the African Caribbean experience with the British experience, let me also think about this is so important to have this integration, which I'm right now also researching on the spirituality of aging in the intercultural environment, how the Western Christianity rooted, roots, for instance, the Chinese wisdom culture are so important for the aging groups of people to manifest and being respected. Would like to get your views on this.
Okay. Well, obviously, would not want to speak too specifically on a Chinese context that you speak of, because you're much more knowledgeable about that than I am. But I think in more broader terms, I think this type of integration is important, but I think it's difficult for 2 reasons. One is, and again, I don't talk about the Chinese context. I can only talk about the African Caribbean perspective and Christianity and white British Christianity. It's difficult for 2 reasons. Firstly, that trying to integrate entities that have huge disparities in power and acceptability is difficult, because what you've got is one thing that is normative and is deemed to be superior, alongside something else that has been deemed to be heretical, problematic, demonic at worst, culturally problematic, backward. There's a whole set of pejorative terms that you can use to talk about African religio-cultural aspects of life. And therefore, how you find a synthesis and a form of partnership when there's a disparity in power is difficult. Because notions of partnership can be problematic. So, for example, I'm reminded of the words of James Cone, who says, well, partnership doesn't tell you anything about the respective power relationships between the entities in partnership. So the horse and the rider are in partnership, but they're not equals. So therefore, how you find ways of accommodation where one is being demonized to the point whereby even to get people to own it. So one of the things I didn't say in the paper was that actually part of the difficulty of doing this research was to get people on camera to say, not just that you do these things, but so what's your understanding of it? What's your meaning of it? to her dying day, like my mum would do her practices, and I would every now and again say, so mum, so why are you doing that? She said, oh, never you mind. It's like, well, yeah, but, you know, but like you do it consistently. Well, you know, I mean, that's not for you to know. And it's like, yeah, but I'm your son, you know. I mean, well, I don't want you to get involved with my all-time nonsense. And it's like, but mom, it's not nonsense. It's like, well, you know, I mean, she just would not go on record to talk about it. Although she knew it was important, she also felt a sense of embarrassment because a part of her was thinking, but I'm a saved, converted, sanctified, Holy Spirit-filled Methodist Christian. I shouldn't really be doing this stuff, even though I know it's important enough that I can't give it up. That's the difficulty of trying to both to affirm it and to have a form of discourse about aspects of our lives that have been so traduced by colonialism and empire, that therefore makes that type of integration. It's not impossible, but it's difficult, and I think will continue to be so for a long time yet.